Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for attending our most recent Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime series. The topics we're going to cover in this series for this week and the next 4 coming weeks is navigating new guidelines that are coming to us from different government institutions, FDA and USDA, along with some parasite control, which is becoming an important issue in our production systems, especially in these years where we actually do get some rainfall. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Rosslyn Biggs. She's going to be our speaker today, and she's the co-host of Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime series.
Hi, everyone. We're glad you're online with us today. We'll see you hopefully for the next 3 weeks after this. And then if you are looking for additional, maybe recorded options that we've had in the past, those, as always, are on beef.okstate.edu and our archived webinars. Cave, I'll have you just put that link in the chat when you have a second, and we'll go ahead and get going. As Dr. Beck said, I'm Rosslyn Biggs. I am an extension veterinarian housed within the College of Veterinary Medicine. And we're going to talk a little bit today about kind of the future of livestock medications and where we just need to be aware of some of the current guideline change. I think most producers are cognizant of this, but give you a little bit of background, maybe how we got here, and then some tips for making sure that we're able to continue on. So with that, as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about what's changing, and then why are we seeing these changes, and then how to prepare. So June 11th, 2023, this relates to FDA guidance for industry number 263, and you can read that if you're interested, the particulars of that on the FDA website. As I mentioned, it went into effect June 11th, 2023, and what that change looked like was companies that produce, in particular, antibiotics, were asked to voluntarily change their labels to require anything that was, well, I've got to be cautious there, medically important antibiotics. We'll get to that in just a second. Medically important antibiotics that were over the counter, moving to veterinary prescriptions. So that is one of those things that, again, it's medically important only. So you may be asking yourself, well, what is medically important? Medically important is those antibiotics that are used in human medicine. And so it really only relates to 4% of all our products. And the most common ones that you would generally see over the counter historically in most of your feed stores, that kind of thing, would be penicillin and oxytetracycline. And so again, it's only medically important. We'll talk a little bit about what that did not impact. So it does not impact whatsoever your current veterinary feed directives. If you're not familiar with veterinary feed directives, 5 or 6 years ago, the time gets past me, but there were some changes that required when we had antibiotics that were placed in feed. The common one in this part of the world would be chlortetracycline or CTC that would have been put in feed for the use of helping to control anaplasmosis. That would be a common one that a VFD would apply. So if you already have a VFD in place and you've worked with your veterinarian to establish those remain unchanged. It also does not impact anthelmintics, and we're going to talk a little bit in the coming weeks more about anthelmintics, but anthelmintics, common name is our dewormers. And so it does not impact your dewormers. Your dewormers still remain over the counter. It does not impact oral mineral, and it does not impact ionophores. So technically ionophores are still antimicrobials. However, again, as we saw on the previous slide, those are not medically important, meaning that in human medicine will not use monensin and lasallicid at all. And so those, again, remain unaffected for the purposes that we use them in animal health. So how did we get here? Well, one of the primary reasons the FDA outlined was the development of antimicrobial resistance. And in this case, we're going to talk heavily today about antibiotics. So when it comes to things like pharmaceutical stewardship, and we'll talk about this, our counterparts, Dr. Navarre and Dr. Gillum, will in the next 2 weeks when it relates to anthelmintics. So I'm going to try to leave that for their presentations. But pharmaceutical stewardship, we really have limited options on the shelf. There are no new classes, although you might go, well, hey, I saw that new antibiotic that came out a couple of years ago. Those are antibiotics still within the same class. And so we have no new classes coming out. They're not coming from research and development. However, we are seeing new strains of organisms, and in particular, organisms that are resistant. And we're going to speak specifically to our bacteria here. And we're seeing resistance in human medicine as well as animal medicine. A common one that you may have seen on, the nightly news in human medicine would be something like methicillin-resistant Staph aureus or MRSA. That would be a very common antibiotic-resistant bacteria that we see more frequently in human medicine. And actually, we see it in animal medicine as well now. And so in animal medicine, we'll talk a little bit more about resistance. The things I want to point out to you when it comes to resistance is we are seeing resistance. This particular data is from the Oklahoma Animal Disease Diagnostic Laboratory. And I do have some cautions when we share this. First of all, I don't want you going home and talking with your veterinarian about we're going to change our whole system based on this antimicrobial susceptibility profiles. Don't run home and say, Dr. Biggs said we got to use this antibiotic, because that's not what we're saying here at all. But this is evidence of samples that were submitted right here in Oklahoma to our Animal Disease Diagnostic Laboratory of those isolates that were sent to them, of resistance that was, at least in the laboratory setting, was present. And so you'll see here, you see this note at the top where it says data reported as % susceptible. So we'll take a common antibiotic that is routinely used for bovine respiratory disease, such as enrofloxacin. Enrofloxacin, with these, again, across the top, these are common bacteria that we see as components of bovine respiratory disease, Mannheimia hemolytica, for instance. When I was in school, that was Pasteurella hemolytica. The name has changed, but most producers are going to be familiar with that particular organism, that particular bacteria. So at least in the samples that our diagnostic lab here in Oklahoma saw, and again, this was 18, that was the total number of isolates they saw. So that doesn't cover all of our bovine respiratory disease, again, in the field. But in their laboratory setting, only 44% of those samples that were tested were susceptible to this particular antibiotic. And this is, again, a really common antibiotic. We mentioned previously penicillin. Penicillin was a common over-the-counter antibiotic. And you can see here, 67% of those Mannheimia hemolytica isolates that we saw at the ODA lab, 67% of those were susceptible. Now, penicillin, oxytetracycline, in my hands, those are not drugs that I reach for, frankly, in bovine medicine on a regular basis, particularly to treat bovine respiratory disease. And so when we talk about pharmaceutical stewardship, these are common. Tetracycline, only 27% of the isolates that the lab saw. Of the 11 isolates that they saw were susceptible for Mannheimia hemolytica. Only 27% of those particular bacteria isolates were susceptible. And so the reason for this, again, is not to go home and change your treatment plans. It's not to go home and stock up on new antibiotics. But we need to be cognizant that we have a limited number of tools in our toolkit. We have a limited number of antibiotics available to us, and certainly a number of classes. Our goal through pharmaceutical stewardship is to use those appropriately and use them only when they are needed, so that we have those antibiotics for as long as possible. I need all of the tools in my battery to effectively treat animals, and that relates to good animal welfare. We want those products to be effective, because if we get to a point where antibiotics are not working, where they're not effective in the field, that impacts animal welfare, that impacts the health of those animals, and that impacts ultimately the bottom line of producers. So I wanted to bring up some other concepts when it comes to pharmaceutical stewardship, just to be aware. At the end of the day, those of us in the beef industry must be cognizant of consumers. Now, I want to be, we'll get back to it on the wrap up, a few more things related to this change. But when it comes to consumers, we have varying perceptions, as everyone on the line knows, about how antibiotics should be used. And we have very true understanding of our consumers, and they have preferences based on that. We all have a confidence. I have a confidence when I work with a producer that producer is following the label, is following the guidance that I have available, that we are meeting withdrawal times before we put those animals into market, harvest change, so that our consumers don't end up with antibiotic residues on their grocery store shelf. So this is information, and it's a little bit of a busy slide, and so, but there are things I want to point out. This information is based on the consumer beef tracker done in 2022 from those at NCBA, a contractor to the beef checkoff. And so when we ask consumers, what is your trust level? Their consumer trust level fell below 50% when asked to consider industry antibiotic, again, back to that antibiotic perception, and as well as hormone usage. We'll also talk about changes to labels of implants, so hormone usage, in our last of this series of the ranchers. But it's important to recognize again that when we ask consumers, are antibiotics being used responsibly by producers, 46% trusted that we were doing that, 26% weren't sure, and then we have a certain percentage, again, this 28% of our consumers that don't trust how we're doing things. And so we have to tell our story that we are following the appropriate guidance, that we have the best interests of our animals at heart, and that we're following through with that. This is additional information. So again, it's back to telling that story. Fortunately for us on the line today, I think we're probably heavily producers. I saw some veterinarians that had joined as well. Veterinarians, farmers, and ranchers are viewed to be the most credible sources of information when it comes to production practices, and that includes antibiotic usage. And so we want to tell our story in the best way, and we want to hold to the guidance that is provided, so we're meeting consumer expectations. Again, these are more information about antibiotic usage from the NCBA contractor to the beef checkoff, again, from that consumer beef tracker survey. And this shows us a number of things, but we want to, the things that concern me about some of this is we have a certain percentage of consumers that don't think antibiotics should be used ever. And that impacts you all on the line. Understand that we need these tools in our toolkit to make sure that we have the ability to effectively treat animals each and every day. So again, when consumers were asked, when it talks about food choices and safety, hormones and antibiotics, as well as E. coli, processed meat, they come up again and again strongly with consumers on things they are concerned about. So again, consumers care how we're using antibiotics. And so there's a number of reasons we want to be using it to the best of our abilities. So a couple things I want to point out when it comes to the changes of these labels. First of all, if you go to the feed store, you may notice that there are still antibiotics on the shelf, and those antibiotics are available for you to purchase. Again, that June 11th change was labeling changes by the manufacturers. And so you will still see over-the-counter antibiotics available for purchase until they bleed out through the system. Until they're purchased and until they're used up, you may still see those on the store shelves. And so don't be alarmed or don't be confused by why I thought we were changing this. Those products will continue to be sold until either they are used throughout the system or they meet their expiration dates. Additionally, we do have feed stores that are changing how they sell products. In particular, some are even becoming getting their pharmacy license. And so the accessibility of those products with veterinary prescription may be, as we will have to see how it rolls out. But in some instances, in some geographic areas, it may be more convenient for you. In fact, if you have that veterinary prescription, if your feed store pursues that pharmacy licensure. So again, how do we prepare? Well, first of all, if you are a producer that does not have a relationship with a veterinarian, and those that have heard me before, this is kind of my, this is my talk. This is the topic that I feel very strongly about. You need to get a veterinarian, and the time to develop that relationship is not at 2 a.m. when you have a calving call. In fact, we'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of slides, but because of some of the limitations within the veterinary profession and the availability of veterinarians, if you are not an established client with a veterinary practice, many practices will not see your emergencies. They simply will not. They don't have the capacity to have that coverage. And so again, reach out if you don't already have that relationship and establish, or again, maintain your veterinary client-patient relationship. And that relates to having medically appropriate and timely visits. So there's some flexibility when it comes to veterinary practice acts across the nation. And that allows us, and the Veterinary Practice Act is what guides us as veterinarians for our licenses on what constitutes a veterinary client-patient relationship. But I will say this, if you have not been in conjunction with your veterinarian or your veterinary practice, in particular in the last year, they are not likely to write you a veterinary prescription. So this is also something that with this particular change by the FDA, there have been a lot of maybe myths or misinformation. This is not a change that you now have to have each animal that needs an antibiotic administered, that animal is going to have to be seen by a veterinarian. None of that changes. You just, if you are wanting over-the-counter antibiotics, previously over-the-counter antibiotics, you're now going to have a veterinary prescription. I should also point out, we're on a beef-focused webinar today, but this applies to all species. It is not specific just to cattle. So if you have friends or family members that don't have a veterinary relationship and are routinely purchasing antibiotics at the feed store, then they're going to want to develop that. If they have horses, for instance, this still applies across species. So other ways that we can prepare, other ways that we can be ready to go. Again, first of all, we want to have that veterinary relationship. Secondly, we can enhance our biosecurity, because if we improve our biosecurity, then we hopefully don't need to use antibiotics at the level that we are using them. And so biosecurity measures are a good tool to add if you're not already incorporating those. And I'll give you some resources to look into that. We don't have time today to get into the details there. Also encourage you to develop herd health plans. those are treatment plans. Those are having the discussions with your veterinarian when it's not an emergency. It's before, that set of stalker calves turns into a train wreck. We're going to do it this way. We're also going to have preventative measures. We're going to have vaccination plans in place. If I identify that a cow I think she has foot rot, we're going to administer her one dose. And then if she's not improved in 2 or 3 days, then we're going to go to our next best option. And by the way, the next best option is probably not giving her another dose of antibiotics. We also want to improve our record keeping. We want to improve our record keeping because we want to have data-driven decisions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So again, back to that veterinary client-patient relationship, or the VCPR. These are the fundamental points of really all veterinary client-patient relationship that says, I, as your veterinarian, assume responsibility for making medical judgments about the health of the animals, and in turn, the client or the producer has agreed to follow those instructions. It says that I have sufficient knowledge of the animal or animals to develop a general or preliminary diagnosis of the condition, and that I'm readily available for follow-up in the event of an adverse drug reaction or treatment failure. And so if you are, I have given this presentation to a handful of groups. I got the question like, well, I'm purchasing my antibiotics directly from my veterinarian. How does this impact me? The answer to that is it's not going to impact you whatsoever. Those kind of practices where you're purchasing directly from your veterinarian, or you're already have your treatment plans, you have a good established VCPR with your veterinarian, none of this is probably going to change anything you are doing. It is those producers that don't have a veterinary client-patient relationship, those producers that aren't seeking out veterinary input into their operation, those are the ones that are going to feel it most. So many of you may be saying, if you don't have a veterinary client-patient relationship, well, gosh, it's hard to get into the veterinarian. And frankly, in many geographic areas, you're absolutely right. And so I thought it was worth mentioning. And again, this is one of my interests when it comes to the university and research and programming, is talking about rural veterinary shortage, talking about rural foods, and as well as food supply veterinary under service. And so just to give you a little perspective as far as the profession goes, this is information out of the 23 economic state of the veterinary profession. So this is a survey that was done in 2022 by the American Veterinary Medical Association. Only 7%, I rounded up because I'm the optimist, of course, only 7% of our veterinarians that responded to that survey, and it represents a big chunk of our veterinarians. Only 7% are either food animal or mixed animal. And so we're seeing the impacts of this in many areas. Many of you all may be feeling that. And so please know that here at Oklahoma State University with animal science, as well as the College of Veterinary Medicine and Extension and our friends in AgEcon, we have some programming that's seeking to address that. I thought it was also important to mention some other veterinary prescribing challenges that make it harder for veterinarians to do or practice in the way maybe they historically have. Extra label drug use is being looked at more closely than it ever has. And extra label drug use is when you use a product that is not outlined by the label. So if you are a small ruminant producer, in many cases, those species have to have extra label drug use because there's not a lot of things labeled for sheep and goats. However, we're being looked at more critically, and we are having to be significant increases in record keeping requirements related to those products and others. It's also important to recognize that when it comes to extra label drugs, we have a number of drugs, in particular fluoroquinolones and cephalosporins, largely because, again, they are medically important, that even as much as I would want to use that in a way that is not on the label, meaning that I cannot use that product. If it's not labeled for foot rot, I need to reach for a product that is labeled for foot rot. So these two sets of antibiotics, fluoroquinolones and cephalosporins, cannot be used in an extra label fashion. We've also experienced within the veterinary profession a number of back orders. Penicillin, even for, I have a number of horses at my house. I like to keep penicillin on hand so that I can use it. It became very, very difficult to obtain in many instances. And then we also have veterinary prescriptions, in particular, some of our sedatives and tranquilizers that are becoming more difficult for us to use, more difficult for us to obtain. And there is legislation at the national level looking at that because, unfortunately, we have individuals that are using those products in an illicit manner. And that is making it, again, harder for veterinarians to do their jobs, harder for producers and veterinarians to do their jobs. And ultimately, there's impacts to animal welfare. So just giving you a little bit more perspective about the veterinarians. I also would like to point out when it comes to this change from over-the-counter to veterinary prescription, don't vilify your veterinarian. This was not something that veterinarians, we've got more than enough to do. This is not something that we were leading the charge for that change, if I can speak for the profession. So again, back to biosecurity, how can that help us? So biosecurity, and you're going to go, why do you have a lot of words on the slide? Biosecurity, again, is the development and implementation. I'll tell you why we have all those words on the slides. But it's those management procedures to reduce or prevent unwanted disease from entering the herd, or if we have it in the herd, limiting the spread within the operation. And so biosecurity, we actually did a survey here in 2022 of Oklahoma cow-calf producers, and we had over 1,400 responses. So if you are one of those producers that received one of these surveys, we really, really appreciate that. And our goal was to determine the state of biosecurity knowledge and implementation amongst our beef cattle producers here in the U.S. This was a grant that was funded by the USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection Services through their National Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Program. And so with that, this was led by Dr. Hagerman out of Ag Econ here at OSU, as well as Dr. Raper. I was on this project as well as Dr. Whitworth. So now you're going to realize in the next slide why I thought it might be necessary to give you that definition of biosecurity. So I think there's the opportunity that many producers have biosecurity practices. They just don't frame it like that. They don't call them biosecurity. We're still working on these numbers. A number of these numbers that survey data have to yet to be cleared. And so we'll have more information as we go along. But this is information that has been released. We ask producers, how familiar are you with the definition of biosecurity? Unfortunately, 31% of our producers said, I've never heard of it. And so that gives those of us an extension, particularly those of us that have an interest in biosecurity, a lot of opportunity for education. So stand by for that. More will be coming in the future. And then on the other hand of this, we had 13% of producers that said, hey, I really understand biosecurity. I've implemented these principles on my farm or ranch, and they're marching forward. So hopefully, for those of you all that are on the line, hopefully you fall into this 13% rather than 31%. If you were one of this 31%, we've covered the definition of biosecurity here today, and that you will hopefully have a better understanding. If you're looking for more information as far as how can I implement biosecurity, I've listed here a number of resources. Beefqualityassurance.org is a great resource. They have this daily biosecurity plan for disease prevention. They also have this online educational module. And the beauty of this particular module, in my opinion, is that as you work through it, it plugs and chugs. And at the end of the course, you'll have a biosecurity plan specific for your operation. This particular educational module is at no cost to producers. And so if you're looking for those options, you can seek out bqa.org. Also want to put a plug if you're looking for, maybe you're one that likes to do a lot of reading. A great resource is the OSU Beef Cattle Manual. And we have a new edition out. Dr. Raper is responsible for those. Dr. Beck and Dr. Lawman, Dr. Whitworth, a number of us here at Oklahoma State were involved in those revisions. And so if you're looking for that, we can get you connected with getting you a new manual, perhaps if you have an old one. And then also I want to mention the securebeefsupply.org. So the Secure Beef Supply is biosecurity resources, but it has a little bit of a different spin. Its goal is to help producers prepare in the event we were to have an introduction of a foreign animal disease. The most common foreign animal disease in the beef industry that we're worried about is foot and mouth disease. And so if you're looking for more, maybe you have a biosecurity plan and you're using those practices on a daily basis, but you're wanting to be prepared, you're wanting to be able to step that up, you can reach out to securebeefsupply.org. And if we have an opportunity, we'll put those links in the chat so you can click as we conclude our webinar today. So when it comes to herd health plans, again, as I mentioned before, you really need to coordinate with your veterinarian, and each individual operation should have its own herd health plan. And frankly, if you have multiple units within your operation or different classes of cattle within your operation, you can have a different herd health plan for each one of those groups. And so where to start with those herd health plans, in my opinion, is to coordinate with your veterinarian. This picture here that you can see is Dr. John Gillum. You'll hear from him in a couple of weeks. When it comes to parasite, he's one of our clinical professors at the OSU College of Veterinary Medicine, and he's done some research when it comes to parasite resistance. So hopefully you can join us for that in a couple of weeks. When you start with your veterinarian, this is a time, it's really not a time to discuss this, in my opinion, when you're dealing with that calving call or that emergency. I actually like to do those, find the convenient time of year. The beginning of the year, the beginning of the calendar year is oftentimes a really good chance to sit down, sit across the kitchen table or sit in the office across the desk and line out what your priorities are. Identify what's the risk assessment, what kind of risk does my herd have in front of them. And then talk about things like, are you doing new introduction testing? New introduction testing, back to biosecurity, is one of those things that I think we can improve upon. But you need to know what your risks are so you know what potentially to test from. We also want to talk about another measure of biosecurity, and that's isolation and quarantine. In general, new groups of cattle or cattle that have traveled, for instance, perhaps you're like me and you've got kids that show. If cattle leave the operation and return, we really want to keep those individuals isolated for at least 30 days. That allows anything they've been exposed to while they traveled or anything that they could potentially be bringing into the operation if these are new purchases, and that includes bulls, that allows that to express itself. We get past the incubation period. 30 days is generally going to cover most instances. If you're able to isolate, quarantine for longer than that, that's all the better. And again, as I mentioned before, we want to talk about treatment plans. When does the emergency show up? When is that cow going to be lame? When does it turn into, calves with snotty noses? It's never Tuesday at 9 in the morning, right? It's always going to be when it's not convenient. So if we can have these treatment plans for common disorders, common situations that you see in your operation or could potentially see based on the knowledge of your veterinarian, you can lay those treatment plans out. If you're looking for a template for that, I'm happy to send that to you. OSU has a good treatment template that you can start from if you're looking for that. But again, it sets up these discussions so we're not having to rush around and try to get a veterinary visit or try to get these products, try to get these treatment options gathered up in that we're set and ready to go for what we could potentially face. I also want to point out record keeping. As I mentioned before, if you're not record keeping, then you're absolutely not making data-driven decisions. And we need data. We need the records to make decisions, much beyond just is that cow pregnant or not. We need to know if we have a treatment plan and we're using a particular antibiotic, for instance, is that effective or is it not being effective? Are we having to pull those cattle and treat more than once? Or maybe we have a diagnosis at the most basic level that's not being effective. So we want these data-driven decisions. Also want to encourage individual identification. One of the reasons why I put this image up on the screen is it is continuing discussion at the USDA level that right now, if you're familiar with metal tags, so that's going to be those orange brucellosis or bangs tags or those silver bright tags that you might have seen during brucellosis testing or that have come through the sale barn. The USDA has proposed, now it's not official, that is not in place, so please don't get me wrong, but has proposed to transition those metal tags over to electronic ID. And that's only for those animals. It's not for all animals, okay? It's only for those animals that are required to be officially identified. So if you're wondering, well, what animals have to be officially identified? In beef cattle, that's sexually intact animals over 18 months of age. And so if you sell groups of calves when they're 9 months of age, they're not going to be required to have, they're not required now to have official identification, nor would they with this change. It is simply a move from metal tags to these electronic IDs. You'll notice that this is an official USDA tag because it starts with 840. That's our country code here in the US, but it also has a US shield on it. And so again, those metal tags are likely to transition, I would say, in the next year or so to these tags based on the feedback that I am hearing, but you need to stand by. That's one of those changes that may or may not impact you based on how you market your cattle. It's also record keeping is one of those things that has herd protection, right? Like I can show what I've administered for those animals. Record keeping is important if you participate in certain programs. Like if you participate in a natural program, we want to have those records that support that these cattle that I've raised meet this program. And it's also, I joke that I'm a wannabe ag economist. It gets down to the economics of it, that if we have good records, then we can again make data-driven decisions, and ultimately that makes a difference when we're assessing our bottom line. So in summary, for producers today, we really just want you to understand these changes. Again, the one that is kind of, right there has happened this summer is this change of over-the-counter antibiotics moving to veterinary prescription. Again, those particular antibiotics in my hands, particularly for beef cattle, are not ones that I reach for on a regular basis. However, they may be based on your operation, but we want you to coordinate with your veterinarian to understand these changes and be prepared so you're not caught off guard if you run into a situation where you're needing those products. Also, I want to encourage you when it comes to pharmaceutical stewardship, whether that be antibiotics. We'll talk a little bit about dewormers in the next couple of weeks. Please do your part. The classic example is, and we see it routinely at the College of Vet Med at our hospital, is a lame cow that has been treated multiple times with oxytetracycline. She's been treated multiple times with antibiotics, and because they thought it was foot rot, if she's not responded in 2 or 3 days and much improved, you probably have something else going on. And so we want you to we each have a role in doing our part to make sure that these particular products stay on our shelves, stay in our toolkit as long as possible, and that they're effective so that we can be certain that we are positively impacting animal welfare. And then again, be prepared. Work with your veterinarian. If you don't have an established relationship with a veterinarian, work to find a veterinarian that meets your needs and is in potentially your area. We have veterinarians that are really doing lots of traveling. You may have a veterinarian that does not live next to you, and that's not uncommon these days. And so we need to be cognizant that the veterinary profession is changing in some ways. And so what's been available to us historically, we may not be practicing in that way anymore. That availability may not happen. So we want you to be prepared. We want you to have those records in place. We want you to talk about what the goals of your operation are with your veterinarian, and talk about what are our herd health plans? What are the preventives we can do? What are the things, what are the biosecurity measures that we can implement so we hopefully don't have problems? And if we do realize that we have an issue, we're ready to go with treatment plans related to that. So with that, this has my contact information. We are really available to you if you have questions, and are happy to take those now if you're interested in that. Cabe is our event specialist at the College of Vet Med, and she's been kind enough to put a number of these links in the chat. All right.
So I'd like to remind everybody,
Any
if you have
questions?
questions, to put them in our chat, and we can relay them on to Dr. Biggs.
We will take a moment. We're going to put a plug in for a parasite study that we are doing. And Cabe, if you can find that link. Oh, great. She's already got it for us. We do have an ongoing parasite study evaluating anthelmintics in the state of Oklahoma. So if you are an Oklahoma producer, you may want to take a look at this Okstate Qualtrics link that Cabe has just put into the chat. That is available through spring of next year. That will allow some fecal egg count reduction testing to go on, and we can put you in coordination with your extension educator in your area to help collect those samples. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming weeks, but I thought we would go ahead and put a plug in at each one of these sessions in case you're one that can only join us live this one time. That particular, if you'll click on that link, it'll tell you more information about that particular study. That study is in partnership. Dr. Lawman, Dr. Beck, and Dr. Gillum and myself are on that. And it builds upon some of the information you'll hear about from Dr. Gillum in a couple of weeks. All right, Dr. Beck, I'm not seeing any questions.